My name is Michael Philby. My near-death experience is due to stabbing at the age of 15. On December 11th, 1970, my father, mother, brother, and I went shopping at a store called Times Square Stores on London Boulevard in Brooklyn, New York. I wanted a particular type of stereo that played cassettes and records, and we found one called the Panasonic SE990 for $199. As you walk into the showroom, it was on the top shelf about eye level to the right, and I fell in love with the unit immediately, because at that time it was not the highest quality unit, but certainly the best-looking unit in the store. That was a great deal of money, but my father said he would purchase the unit for me, and he did so. We then proceeded to the drapery department where my mother was immediately for the last of a concession sold food and drinks. Dad purchased a bunch of frankfurters and sodas. Then we went over to the steps at the rear of the store concession and walked up to the middle platform and put our packages down, and we ate our frankfurters on the steps. Dad was standing on the platform that was about 5 feet wide in between two sets of steps, 13 down and 11 towards the higher level. I asked my mother if I would be able to use the stereo system before Christmas, because typically we weren't allowed to open our gifts before Christmas. Mom said you'll have to ask your father, and I did. He explained that he thought it would be okay because I might be dead before Christmas. We all looked at him funny, not knowing why he would say something like that. As it turns out, 96 hours later, almost to the minute, I would be stabbed approximately 150 feet from the above entrance, and run to that doorway to seek help, all the while knowing after being slashed that my life was going to cease to exist within moments. My brother and I were in the store shopping for electric Norelco razors for my mother and father's Christmas presents, and we saw 3 black men following us, at which point I said, "Let's go upstairs," then use the upstairs exit. I explained to my brother if anything happened to run around to the side entrance, because I had a bad feeling, and he was 2 years younger and really didn't know what was going on. I knew what was going on because I had been trained in judo and jiu-jitsu for 4 years for this type of occurrence, and knew that we were about to be attacked because of my training. We thought we lost them, and when we walked out the front, though, we may be right, and walked about 200 feet from the front entrance through the parking lot. One of the men jumped out from between 2 parked cars and got right in our face saying, "Give me all your money and your presents." I throw him immediately to the ground, and before he hit the ground, 2 more black men came up from behind us and slashed my back open from my spine to the side of my rib cage. My brother was stabbed twice in the kidney and in the lung. Then they ran away, not taking our packages. Nor were they trying to get our money, they were simply out to stab a couple of white boys. I grabbed the bag with the presents in it, and my brother, and told him we must run to the side entrance to get help. When I started running, I realized that what I believed to be a punch in the kidneys was really a knife wound, and that inside my mind I knew I was about to die. We both ran around the side of the building to the side staircase that we have eaten frankfurters on for days prior. When I ran into the building, there was a black security guard, and I explained to him that we had been stabbed, and he thought we were kidding. All the while I was holding my back together, because when I reached back, I could feel my rib cage, and the blood was already down to my knees, because I have a 10-inch gash from a razor knife, and I was bleeding to death. The security guard thought we were kidding. When I screamed at him, turned around and showed him my back, he threw me on the floor and told me to lay still. He called the police on a phone at the top of the stairs, which was part of the building security system, and the police were there within 2 or 3 minutes. When I was lying on the top platform, I saw several people I knew at the bottom of the steps in the lower level of the store because the platform was about 14 feet wide. It was a very open view. I didn't say hello to them because I had other things on my mind, including that I was about to die, and was perfectly okay with this. Also, when the blood started flowing down the 11 steps between where I was lying on the floor to the middle platform where my father had been standing 4 days before this, at almost the exact same time, I noticed the blood started to create a puddle 11 steps down on the platform itself where my father had been standing. Dad ran into the store because he had been parked in the parking lot waiting for us, and saw the commotion, but didn't know what happened. When he got into the store, he saw that my brother and I were lying on the floor, both bleeding. Only moments later, the police came. This police officer, who I believe was a Vietnam veteran, simply put one hand under my chest and grabbed both halves of the flesh wound and clamped them closed with his own bare hand. He picked me up, walked me into his police cruiser, and sat me on his lap. The other police officer drove us to the hospital that was less than 1,000 feet away. I remember asking the police officer how bad it was, and he said it was just a scratch. But I knew he was lying because of the puddle of blood on the middle platform, and the fact that I had felt my own ribcage, so I realized I wasn't going to get anything truthful from him. We were at the hospital in less than 1 minute. There was a stretcher waiting in the parking lot that went down several switchback ramps, and I was facing forward after they put me on the stretcher, and still the police officer was holding my wound closed with his bare hands. This was quite an interesting experience, and I remember that the stretcher itself had gotten partially loose from the people running us down the ramp, and they smashed me into the wall, which I thought was rather funny, all things considered, and knowing I was going to die anyway, I told him to slow down, but he didn't hear me. By the time we got into the emergency room, they were already hauling people out with superficial wounds and broken bones. There was an entire team of people coming from all directions asking questions from only me because my father and brother still hadn't arrived. They were asking me if I was allergic or had any special medical conditions. The police officer was still holding my wound together, but only a few moments into the procedure there were already a dozen people crowded around me doing things. There was a short fellow who I learned was the head surgeon, called the doctor in charge of the operation. At which point, several people started clamping things on my back, and the doctor was explaining what needed to be done. The police officer, when I looked up, was talking to my father, and my brother was in the stretcher next to mine on the other side of the people that were working on myself. There was also a team of people working on him. His wounds were deep, but they had not hit anything vital, and it took them a while to stabilize him and run all the tests while they were still working on me. Apparently there is a procedure in a case like this that they give you somebody to keep you occupied, so you're not thinking about what's going on around you. They were not able to give me any kind of pain sedation because they didn't know if I was allergic to anything, and they needed to work on me while I was conscious because I had lost so much blood. They feared if they sedated me, I wouldn't wake up. This fellow they put in front of my face because I was lying on my stomach started talking to me about baseball. There isn't anything in life I hate more than baseball. I never played baseball, I never liked baseball, and I had only went to one baseball game in my entire life, and that was the 1969 World Series Mets game on the last day. I explained to this fellow I don't like baseball, and that he needed to leave me alone. I wanted to think about what was going to happen. He asked me what I thought was going to happen, and I told him that I was going to die, and I didn't need him asking me any more questions. He kept talking, but I didn't pay any attention to him from that point on, and was kind of looking around the room at all the things that were going on around me. At some point, I looked up and saw that my father's brother had brought my mother to the hospital, and that my mother, father, and his brother were standing in a doorway about 40 feet from where I was staring at me. This I didn't pay much attention to because I was thinking to myself what it was like to die. And for some strange reason, I kept thinking I was going to see my grandmother because she had died not too long before that. This was all quite clear in my mind, that there was this inevitability that I was going to move on and be dead shortly. No matter what the doctors did, it would make no difference. The outcome was going to be the same. I would be dead within moments. This fellow, who was designated to keep me company, was still talking to me, but something strange started to happen. I started to be able to hear all the voices in the room independently from one another, and I could comprehend each word that was said by several dozen people at the same time. I could hear him and see his lips move because he was right in front of my face. But I was lying on my belly, and there were several people surrounding the operating table itself that were all screaming out different orders in a type of panic mode, and although I didn't care, I knew what was about to happen. But more strange than even hearing all of the voices of the people surrounding me, I could hear the voices in the people in the room, including the police officer that brought me in, and the nurses in the room that my mother and father were in as well. And I could hear their conversations as clear as day. The police officer and a woman named Barbara, who happens to be my next-door neighbor, and the nurse on duty, were having a conversation in regards to what my chances of living were. My mother and father were also in the same room, but they were still in the doorway. There was no way I could have known what was on the other side of that concrete wall, except that when I heard the voices, I could hear through the walls themselves. I knew what direction they were coming from because at this point I was looking at my mother and father still standing in the doorway, and yet the voices were coming from about 15 feet to the left or right through the concrete wall. At that point I waved to my mother and father goodbye because I knew I was about to die, and I closed my eyes. The pain went away, and I started to rise up out of my body. I looked around, and the doctors were getting busy, but none of that mattered, and I took one more look towards my mother and father before I went up through the ceiling. They were crying, yet still I didn't care, especially now that the pain was gone. There were no bright lights like you see in the movies. In fact, once I moved through the ceiling, I was immediately standing inside a huge room with a very high ceiling. I was facing what appeared to be a dozen or so very hard wooden pews, podiums, and behind each pew there was a man in a hooded garment, and the faces, although discernible, were not well lit, kind of like a monk in the monastery. A voice explained to me not to be afraid, which wouldn't have mattered because I wasn't afraid anyway. In a conversational voice, it asked me if I knew why I was there. Apparently, I was dead for all intent and purposes. I explained I knew I was dead, and that was why I was in the room with those people standing behind the high wooden pews. Then it asked me if I had any questions, and I say, because it seemed as if, although the voice came from one you could take it as a person, that it was a group effort, and what I call a group I mean to be a kind of council. It asked me if I thought I had to fill any parts of my life that I didn't accomplish up until my age of 15 years, which was an interesting question. We had a discussion, and I explained that I really didn't know what the future held, but although I was comfortable where I was, there were some things I still wanted to do on Earth. And as if each of the members took turns asking me questions, I would look at the different members behind the pews or podiums, and I call them wooden pews, because I was 15 years old when that occurred, and the only thing I knew to relate to as far as the words are concerned is a pew. However, several questions were asked by the members of the council asking me if I agreed to fulfill a promise. They would allow me to return to this world. At this point, I asked him what that promise would be, and it was explained to me that I would know when the time came. At the same time, it explained to me that it would be something that everybody in the world would come to understand at some point in history, but not in those words. Closer to what was said would be that one day, I would be granted the ability to do something great. I'm not sure how much time went by, but it seemed as if it could have been a half an hour, because before I left I had a conversation with most of the council members, including one about my grandmother, who is apparently okay, but I wasn't going to be able to see or talk to her. Eventually it came down to whether or not my choice was to stay where I was or to go back to the Earth. I kind of thought about my mother and father crying just before I left the room, when I left my body, and I decided to go back so it wouldn't hurt their feelings by dying. But it wasn't my first choice. I did it more for them than for myself, but eventually I said, okay, I'll go back, and one more time, as if in a kind of harmony, it seemed as if all the voices were asking me the same question. If I promise to keep my agreement, they will let me go back. I said I promise. I don't think I was finished saying the word promise itself, and I was in my body staring at this fellow still trying to get my attention while all the doctors were running around like chickens without heads. I turned to the left, towards the doorway where my mother and father was in, and waved to them again, letting them know that I was going to be okay. But I must tell you, at that point the pain was intense, much more intense than it was before I left, because apparently before that I was in shock, and now I was in reality. That fellow standing in front of me was really getting on my nerves, and I told them I wasn't going to talk to him anymore at all, and put my head down and started to think about all that happened. Well, it took about another hour and a half before they sewed me up and did all the testing, and then they took me in for x-rays, and it was around 1 o'clock in the morning by the time I got to a hospital room in a stable condition. They never did give me any painkillers at all, and if they did, I must tell you the pain never stopped. The doctor himself came up with me to the hospital room. I told them what had happened, and that was when he explained to me that it was only a dream. Well, it wasn't a dream. I told him the same story the next day, and he insisted it was only a dream. Either way, it didn't make a difference what he said, and when I explained the same story to my mother and father, they also said it was a dream because apparently they talked to the doctor, and they all knew it was a dream. Watch this near-death experience next about a man who left heaven for his mom's sake and get back to Earth. He also was told the truth about guardian angels and stars.